Welcome back to Mr. Midnight. Tonight we're heading to Alaska to hear 7 of the most disturbing true horror stories from the frozen north. These scary tales come from regular people, truck drivers, waitresses, janitors, and everyday folks who saw something in Alaska that they can't explain. Each story comes from someone who lived through it. People who visited abandoned mines that shouldn't be running, encountered the dead rising from cold water, and discovered ancient creatures sleeping under the ice. These are real accounts that people shared, stories that some tried to hide or didn't believe. If you're new here, subscribe to Mr. Midnight for true horror stories that will keep you up at night. Hit the bell so you don't miss any new videos. Now let's dive into Alaska's most terrifying mysteries, where normal life ends and nightmares become real in a place so cold it can kill you, and so dark that anything can hide in the shadows. My name is Ryan Martinez, and I've been driving delivery trucks for Arctic Medical Supply in Anchorage for 12 years. I know every road between here and Fairbanks, every truck stop, every shortcut. I've delivered everything from basic bandages to life-saving equipment through blizzards, ice storms, and temperatures that would freeze your breath solid. The job isn't glamorous, but it pays well, and I'm good at it. My route schedule is always perfect, my truck is spotless, and I've never missed a delivery. But what happened last September in McCarthy changed everything I thought I knew about my job, about Alaska, and about places that should stay abandoned. The call came in on a Tuesday morning. My supervisor, Janet, handed me a special delivery order with a location I'd never seen before. McCarthy, Alaska, population 28. The only way to reach it was by driving to the end of the McCarthy Road, then walking across a footbridge over the Kennecott River. The delivery was medical equipment for the park ranger station, emergency supplies they needed before winter set in. I loaded my truck with the usual care: 3 boxes of medical monitors, 2 cases of emergency medications, and a portable defibrillator unit. The paperwork said the delivery had to be completed before 6 p.m., and I had to hike about a mile from where I could park my truck to actually reach the town. The McCarthy Road is 60 miles of gravel that ends at a parking area, and from there, you're on foot. I left Anchorage at noon, giving myself plenty of time. The drive was beautiful but lonely, nothing but wilderness and mountains for hours. When I finally reached the end of the road at 4 p.m., I could see the footbridge stretching across the river below. It looked solid enough, but walking across with a loaded dolly would be interesting. That's when I first saw the Kennecott copper mine. It sat on the mountaintop, inside, above the tiny town, like a massive metal skeleton. Even from a mile away, the buildings looked enormous. The main mill building was easily 5 stories tall, and there were dozens of other structures scattered across the hillside, all of them abandoned, all of them perfectly preserved in the dry Alaska air. I'd heard about Kennecott before. It was one of the richest copper mines in history, operating from 1911 to 1938. At its peak, nearly 600 people lived and worked there, processing millions of dollars worth of copper ore. Then the ore ran out, the company shut down operations, and everyone just left. The whole place became a ghost town overnight. I strapped my medical supplies to my dolly and started across the footbridge. The river rushed beneath me, and I could hear my wheels echoing off the metal grating. On the other side, a narrow dirt trail led up toward McCarthy. The town itself was tiny, maybe a dozen buildings total, with the ranger station clearly marked by a Park Service sign. The ranger, Tom Castellanos, was waiting for me. He was probably in his 50s, with the kind of beard and weather-beaten face you expect from someone who spends his life in the wilderness. He helped me unload the supplies and signed the delivery paperwork. "You made good time," he said, checking his watch. "It's only 4:30. You interested in seeing the mine before you head back? I was planning to walk up there anyway, part of my regular patrol." I looked up at the massive structures on the mountainside. I'd always been curious about abandoned places, and this was one of the most famous ghost towns in Alaska. I had plenty of time before dark. "Sure," I said. "How long does it take to get up there?" "About 20 minutes. The trail's well maintained for tourists during the summer, but you're probably one of the last visitors this season. Snow will close everything down soon." We started up the trail toward Kennecott. Tom explained that the mine was now a National Historic Landmark, preserved exactly as it was when operations stopped. As we climbed higher, the buildings got more impressive. The mill building was massive, easily the size of a city block and 5 stories tall. Rust-covered machinery poked out of broken windows, and I could see conveyor belts and ore chutes zigzagging down the mountainside. At its peak, this place processed 200,000 tons of ore per year, Tom said as we walked through the main entrance of the mill building. The machinery you're looking at cost millions of dollars in 1910s money. When they shut down, they just walked away and left everything. Inside the mill, massive copper-green machines filled every floor. Ore crushers the size of houses sat frozen in place, their gears thick with rust and ice. Conveyor belts stretched into the darkness, and catwalks crisscrossed overhead like a mechanical spiderweb. Everything was covered in a thin layer of ice that made the metal gleam in the afternoon light. The whole operation was like a small city, Tom continued, leading me through the different buildings. They had a hospital, a school, a recreation hall, even their own power plant. Most of the workers lived here year-round with their families. We walked through the bunkhouse where single men had lived. Rows of metal bed frames still lined the walls, and personal items sat on shelves as if their owners had just stepped out for a moment. The hospital still had examining tables and old medical equipment that looked primitive compared to what I'd just delivered to McCarthy. "What's the real story about why they closed?" I asked. "Was it really just because the ore ran out?" Tom was quiet for a moment, then shrugged. "Officially, yeah. The high-grade ore was depleted, and it wasn't profitable anymore. But there are local stories about the final year of operation. Workers started disappearing." "Disappearing how?" "Just vanishing from their beds at night. Maybe a dozen men over 6 months. The company blamed bear attacks, but no bodies were ever found. The disappearances stopped the day the mine closed permanently." Tom laughed, but it sounded forced. Probably just workers breaking their contracts and running off. Mining companies weren't exactly known for treating employees well back then. We were standing in the main bunkhouse when my phone died. The screen just went black, even though the battery had been at 60% when I checked it 10 minutes earlier. Tom tried his radio, but it just gave static. "That's weird," he said, frowning at the radio. "This thing works everywhere in the park." I checked my watch. It was 6:15 p.m. "Wait," I said. "That can't be right. We've only been here for 20 minutes. Tom looked at his watch, then at the windows. The sun had set completely. It should have been twilight, but it was full dark outside, like it was past 8 p.m. "That's impossible," Tom said. "I've done this tour 100 times. It takes 45 minutes max. We should have another hour of daylight." Neither of us could account for the missing time. We'd walked through the buildings, Tom had told his stories, and then suddenly it was full dark. We'd lost nearly 2 hours somehow. "We need to get back," Tom said, his voice tight. "The trail gets dangerous in the dark." We left the bunkhouse and started down the trail toward McCarthy. Tom had a flashlight, and we moved carefully on the uneven ground. After 20 minutes of walking, we emerged into a clearing. We were back at the mine entrance. "That's not possible," Tom said, spinning around with his flashlight. "This trail is a straight line down the mountain. We can't have walked in a circle." We tried again, this time Tom carefully marking our path with his knife on trees as we passed. After 30 minutes of hiking, we were back at the mine for the third time. "This doesn't happen," Tom said. And for the first two, I could hear real fear in his voice. "I've walked this trail hundreds of times. It's a straight line. There are no loops, no branches. We should be at McCarthy." The temperature had dropped significantly, and our breath was visible in the beam of Tom's flashlight. We decided to wait in the bunkhouse until dawn rather than risk getting more lost in the dark. That's when we heard the footsteps. They were coming from directly above us on the second floor of the bunkhouse. Slow, rhythmic footsteps, like someone pacing back and forth. The second floor had been declared structurally unsafe years ago. We'd only been on the ground floor during our tour. "Hello?" Tom called out. "Is someone up there?" The footsteps stopped. Then we heard dozens of footsteps, like a crowd of people walking around upstairs, all moving in the same rhythm. The ceiling creaked under the weight. Tom and I ran outside. Every window in the mill building was glowing with warm yellow light, not the harsh white of modern flashlights, but the soft glow of old incandescent bulbs. Through the windows, we could see silhouettes of people moving around inside, operating the machinery. We could hear the mill running. The rhythmic pounding of the ore crushers, the grinding of the gears, the rumble of the conveyor belts. Sounds that hadn't been heard at Kennecott for 85 years. "The mine's running," Tom whispered, grabbing my arm. "The mine is running. That's not possible." A steam whistle blew, 3 long blasts echoing across the mountainside. The shift change whistle. Through the lit windows of the mill, we watched as dozens of figures emerged from the building, walking in formation toward the bunkhouses. They were wearing 1930s work clothes, canvas pants, wool shirts, suspenders, and cloth caps. They carried metal lunch pails and talked to each other as they walked, but there was no sound except their footsteps on the frozen ground. Their mouths moved, but no voices came out. Tom and I hid behind a rusted ore cart as the silent workers passed within feet of us. In the restores, the electric lights, I could see their faces clearly. They all wore the exact same slight smile, and their eyes didn't blink. Every step was perfectly synchronized, like they were marching in a parade. One worker stopped directly in front of our hiding spot. Without moving his body, his head rotated 180 degrees until he was looking straight at us. His smile widened impossibly, his mouth opening far too wide, and he raised one arm and pointed directly at us. Every worker stopped at the same moment. Every head rotated toward us with the same mechanical movement. Dozens of arms pointed at us, all wearing those terrible smiles. Tom and I ran. We crashed through the dark forest, no longer caring about the trail. Behind us, the steam whistle blew again, 3 short blasts this time, and we could hear hundreds of feet running in perfect synchronization, chasing us through the trees. I kept looking back, expecting to see flashlights or torches, but there was nothing except darkness. The footsteps maintained the exact same distance behind us, never getting closer, never falling behind. I tripped over a root and went down hard. Tom hauled me up, and we burst out of the trees onto the footbridge at McCarthy. We'd somehow found our way back. Tom immediately started cutting the support cables with a multi-tool from his belt, and the bridge collapsed into the river behind us. The synchronized footsteps stopped at the far side of the water, and in the darkness, I could see the crowd of workers standing in formation, watching us, still pointing. We locked ourselves in the ranger station until sunrise, neither of us speaking, just listening to make sure nothing had crossed the river. At dawn, we drove back to check on the footbridge. It was intact, like it had never been cut. Across the river, the trail to Kennecott looked completely normal. The mine building sat silent and dark on T. Mountainside. Tom said we must have hallucinated from carbon monoxide or altitude sickness, but we both knew we'd experienced the same impossible things. I drove back to Anchorage and tried to forget about it. 2 weeks later, I woke up at 3 a.m. standing at my front door, fully dressed in my work clothes, holding my truck keys. I had no memory of getting up or getting dressed. When I checked my GPS history, it showed I'd been driving toward McCarthy every night that week, always turning back just before the footbridge. I saw a sleep doctor and got medication, but it didn't help. Every night, I woke up dressed and ready to drive, pulled toward that mine like a magnet. Last week, I gave in. I let myself drive there and crossed the footbridge at 3 a.m. The mine was alive with light and sound, and the workers were waiting for me at the entrance. They parted to let me through, still wearing those smiles, and I walked into the mill building. I found a time card with my name on it, hole-punched for every night I'd almost driven there. A supervisor wearing 1930s clothes, but with a face that looked almost modern, handed me a hard hat and lunch pail and pointed to the ore processing line where a spot stood empty. I punched in my time card and took my position at the machine. It felt right, like coming home after a long absence. When my shift ended at dawn, I punched out and drove back to Anchorage. Tonight, I'll clock in again, and every night after that. Because the mine never really closed. It just moved to a place where time works differently, where the ore never runs out, and they're always hiring. Someday I won't drive back to Anchorage at dawn. I'll just stay for the next shift, and the next. Eventually, someone else will deliver medical supplies to McCarthy and take a tour and lose 2 hours they can't explain, and the mine will have a new employee. The workers who disappeared in 1938 didn't leave. They're still there, they'll always be there, and now I understand why they smile. My name is Linda Martinez, and I've been slinging coffee and hash browns at Millie's Diner in downtown Juneau for 30 years. It's not fancy work, but it pays the bills and keeps me and my son Tyler fed. I've served fishermen heading out for weeks at sea, tourists looking for the real Alaska experience, and locals who've become like family over the decades. I thought I'd seen everything this town could throw at me. Drunk fishermen, angry tourists, even a bear that wandered into the parking lot once. But what happened on October 25, 2018 changed everything I thought I knew about the waters around Juneau. Some things that go down in these cold depths don't stay down. Tyler was 16 then, and like most teenage boys, he was obsessed with something his mom found completely boring. For Tyler, it was shipwrecks. Our little apartment was covered with books about maritime disasters, old newspaper clippings, and maps of the ocean floor around Alaska. He'd spend hours on his laptop reading about ships that had gone down decades ago, studying the passenger lists, memorizing the details of how each vessel met its end. His biggest obsession was the SS Princess Sophia. In 1918, this passenger ship was heading south from Skagway to Seattle when it hit Vanderbilt Reef in a snowstorm. The ship got stuck on the rocks, balanced there for 40 hours while rescue ships waited nearby in the storm. Everyone thought they'd be saved. Then the ship suddenly slipped off the reef and sank in minutes, taking all 353 people down with it. It was the worst maritime disaster in Pacific Northwest history. Tyler had been begging me for months to take him out to the wreck site. He wanted to see where it happened, especially since 2018 marked the 100th anniversary of the sinking. As a single mom working double shifts just to keep up with rent, a charter boat tour wasn't exactly in my budget. But Tyler had been getting good grades, staying out of trouble, and he'd be 17 soon. I figured I could pick up some extra shifts and make it happen. The weather on October 25th was perfect. Calm seas, clear blue skies, not a cloud anywhere. Captain Sarah McKenna ran a small charter business out of the harbor. She was in her 60s, weathered and tough like most people who'd spent their lives on these waters. She'd been giving tours around Juneau for decades, knew every reef and current like the back of her hand. "You sure you want to go out there today?" she asked when we met her at the dock that morning. "It's the anniversary." Tyler practically bounced with excitement. "That's exactly why we want to go. It's been 100 years to the day." Captain Sarah gave me a look I couldn't quite read. Most folks avoid the site on October 25th. Old superstitions. "We're not superstitious," Tyler said quickly. "We just want to pay our respects." Sarah nodded slowly and helped us aboard her boat, a 30-foot vessel called the Mary Catherine. She'd done this run hundreds of times, but something felt different about her that day. She was quieter than usual, more careful checking her equipment. When I asked her about it, she just said she always took extra precautions on important anniversaries. We headed out around 1 p.m. The harbor was busy with fishing boats coming and going, but as we got further from shore, we had the water mostly to ourselves. Tyler sat in the bow with his backpack full of history books, reading facts about the Princess Sophia out loud. "Did you know there were entire families on board?" he said, flipping through pages. "Gold miners heading home to Seattle, businessmen, even a few children. They were all trapped on that ship for almost 2 days, watching the rescue boats but unable to get to them because of the storm." Captain Sarah called back from the wheelhouse. "That's enough of that talk, son. When we get to the site, we're going to be respectful. That's sacred water out there." Tyler rolled his eyes at me, but I kind of understood what Sarah meant. 353 people had died in that exact spot. It wasn't just history. It was a graveyard. We reached Vanderbilt Reef around 2:30 p.m. Captain Sarah cut the engine and dropped anchor directly over the wreck site. The water was maybe 120 feet deep here, too deep to see the ship, but shallow enough that Tyler's fish finder could pick up the sonar outline of the wreck on the bottom. "There she is," Tyler whispered, staring at the display screen. The ghostly outline of the Princess Sophia appeared as a dark shadow on the sonar, still sitting upright on the ocean floor after all these years. Captain Sarah came out of the wheelhouse carrying a small bundle of white flowers. Without saying anything, she tossed them into the water and spoke a quiet prayer. "For the 353, she said simply. Tyler took dozens of photos of the sonar readings and the GPS coordinates. He was in heaven, finally seeing the actual wreck site he'd read about for years. I have to admit, there was something moving about being there. All those people, gone in a matter of minutes when the ship slipped off the reef. We stayed anchored for about an hour. Tyler used the fish finder to trace the outline of the ship below us, talking about the passenger manifest and the rescue attempts. I was starting to relax, thinking this would be a nice memory for both of us, when the weather changed. It happened fast. One minute we had calm seas and sunshine, and the next minute the wind picked up and snow started falling. Not just a few flakes, thick, heavy snow that cut our visibility down to maybe 50 yards. Captain Sarah's face went pale. "This is exactly what happened to them," she said, rushing to start the engine. "The weather just turned like this. We need to go right now." She turned the key, and the engine made a sick coughing sound and died. She tried again. Nothing. Again. Still nothing. "What's wrong?" I asked, but I could see Sarah was genuinely scared now. "Engine won't turn over," she said, popping the hood and checking connections. "Everything looks fine, but it's completely dead." The wind got stronger, pushing us toward the reef. Tyler was still excited, saying this was just like the real disaster, but I was starting to panic. Sarah got on the radio to call for help, but all we got was static. She tried her cell phone. No signal. "This is bad," Sarah said, and hearing the fear in her voice made my stomach drop. "We're drifting toward the same reef that got the Sophia." That's when we heard the voices. At first I thought it was the wind, but as I listened closer I could make out words. Voices calling for help, crying out across the water. Not just one or two voices, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all calling and screaming at once. Tyler stopped taking pictures. "Mom, do you hear that?" Sarah crossed herself. "It's the anniversary," she whispered. "They come back on the anniversary." Through the snow, I saw shapes in the water around our boat. At first, I thought they were debris or maybe seals, but as they got closer, I realized they were people. Dozens of people floating in the water, all wearing old-fashioned clothes and life jackets from 1918. They were reaching up toward our boat, mouths open like they were screaming, but I couldn't hear individual voices anymore. Just that terrible chorus of cries for help that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Tyler, get away from the side," I said, but he was frozen, staring down at the floating figures. The first hands grabbed our boat around 4 p.m. Ice-cold fingers, white and wrinkled from a century underwater, gripping the sides of the Mary Catherine and trying to pull up. Where they touched, frost formed instantly on the fiberglass. "Get off! Get off!" Sarah screamed, hitting at the hand, as with a boat hook. But for every hand she knocked away, two more appeared. The boat started tilting as more and more of them grabbed on. I pulled Tyler away from the edge, but he couldn't. "Stop staring." "Their eyes, Mom. Look at their eyes." The floating people had eyes like clouded glass, white and empty. They weren't breathing. Their chests didn't move, but they were definitely moving, definitely trying to climb into our boat. Sarah was crying now, beating at the hands with everything she could find. "I'm sorry," she screamed at the water. "I'm sorry we disturbed you. We didn't mean any harm." The boat tilted further. Water started splashing over the sides. There were so many hands now, so many desperate dead fingers trying to pull themselves up, trying to drag us down with them. "They're going to sink us," I said, holding Tyler tight as he sobbed against my shoulder. That's when Sarah made her choice. "The count has to be right," she said. And before I could ask what she meant, she jumped over the side into the freezing water. The hands released our boat immediately. They all went for Sarah instead, grabbing her, pulling her down. She didn't even get a chance to scream. Within seconds, she was gone, disappeared beneath the dark water like she'd never existed. The storm stopped instantly. The wind died, the snow cleared, and the sun came out like nothing had happened. The water around our boat was empty and calm. Tyler and I sat there in shock for maybe 10 minutes before I thought to try the engine. It started perfectly on the first try. The radio worked fine. Everything was normal except Captain Sarah was gone. I radioed the Coast Guard and drove us back to harbor as fast as I could. They launched a search immediately, but they never found Sarah's body. The official report said she fell overboard in rough weather and drowned. When Tyler and I tried to tell them what really happened, they just exchanged looks and suggested we were traumatized and imagining things. At Sarah's memorial service a week later, I met her daughter, Rebecca. She was about my age, and she looked tired, like she'd been expecting this day for a long time. Mom had been visiting the Princess Sophia site every October 25th for 40 years, Rebecca told me. Always alone. This was the first year she'd taken passengers on the anniversary. Why? I asked. She needed the money. Business had been slow, and she was behind on boat payments. I begged her not to take the booking, but she said it would be fine. Rebecca pulled out a manila folder full of newspaper clippings. Mom knew the rules. You never bring outsiders on the anniversary. The dead count the living, and if there are more living than should be there, they take someone to balance it out. She showed me the clippings, dozens of them, going back decades. Every October 25th since 1918, someone had drowned near Vanderbilt Reef. Sometimes a fisherman, sometimes a kayaker, always one person, always unexplained. She sacrificed herself to save you and your son, Rebecca said quietly. That's the kind of person my mother was. I felt sick. Tyler and I had survived because Captain Sarah McKenna had thrown herself to the dead. Tyler had nightmares for months after that. He'd wake up screaming about cold hands and clouded eyes. I made him see a therapist, but he said she didn't understand. He said he could hear the voices from the Princess Sophia calling to him every night, asking why he'd left them, saying he was supposed to stay. This past October, as the anniversary approached again, Tyler became obsessed with the wreck site again. But this time it was different. He wasn't excited about the history anymore. He was guilty. I owe them something, he told me. We shouldn't have survived. Captain Sarah knew that. That's why she did what she did. On October 24th, I locked all the doors and hid the car keys. I wasn't going to let him anywhere near the water. But I woke up at 3 a.m. on October 2nd, 5th, to find Tyler's bed empty and the front door standing wide open. I drove to the harbor in my pajamas, and Tyler had already stolen someone's boat. I could see him out on the water, maybe half a mile out, heading straight for Vanderbilt Reef. The Coast Guard responded immediately, but by the time they reached him, Tyler had anchored directly over the wreck site. He was just sitting there calmly, like he was waiting for something. I just wanted to say goodbye, he told them when they brought him back. I held him and cried with relief, thinking it was over. But Tyler wasn't the same after that. The nightmares stopped. He stopped talking about the Princess Sophia. He was calm in a way that scared me more than his obsession had. 2 days later, Tyler walked out of school during lunch and never came back. Security cameras showed him heading toward the waterfront. They found his backpack on the dock at the exact spot where we'd departed with Captain Sarah a year earlier. Inside was a note. I'm going back to even the count. It should have been me. Tell Mom I'm sorry. They searched for 2 weeks but never found Tyler's body. I buried an empty casket, and every October 25th since then, I go to Vanderbilt Reef and throw flowers in the water. Because somewhere down there my son is with the 353 passengers of the Princess Sophia. He's not dead, but he's not alive either. He's in that place where the drowned wait, counting the living, keeping the balance. Last night I woke up at 3 a.m. to hear Tyler's voice calling from outside. Mom, it's cold down here. Please come help me. I know that next October 25th, I'll get in a boat and go to that reef. Because I'm his mother, and he's asking for help. The dead only get louder each year, and eventually you have to answer when they call your name. The count will be even, and the Princess Sophia will finally have its full manifest. My name is Marcus Rodriguez, and I've been a janitor at Fairbanks Medical Center for 15 years. I I clean floors, empty trash, restock supplies, and go home. Same routine every single day. I know every hallway, every supply closet, every corner of that hospital better than my own apartment. I've mopped up blood, vomit, and things I don't want to think about. I've worked Christmas, New Year's, blizzards that shut down the whole city. It's not glamorous work, but it's steady. And in Alaska, steady work means everything. I never thought my job would prepare me for what happened last July. I figured the worst thing I'd ever face was maybe a biohazard spill or finding someone who didn't make it. But what I saw on that mountain, what's been happening since then, makes me wish I'd never left my mop bucket behind. Devin, my younger brother, flew up from Seattle to visit me last summer. He's one of those tech guys who makes good money and thinks Alaska is this big adventure playground. He'd been bugging me for years to show him around, do touristy stuff. I kept telling him I've lived here my whole life and never bothered with any of that tourist nonsense. Why would I pay to see things I can see for free? But Devin wouldn't let it go. He booked us a flight-seeing tour of Denali without even asking me first. Just called me up and said, "Pack a jacket, we're flying around Mount McKinley tomorrow." I tried to get out of it, told him I'd never been in a small plane before and didn't want to start. He said it would be fun, like we were kids again. We drove down to Talkeetna early that morning. It's this tiny town about 2 hours south of Fairbanks, and it's where all the serious mountain climbers start their expeditions. The whole place smells like aviation fuel and coffee, and there are these little planes everywhere, most of them looking like they've seen better days. Our pilot, as this kid named Jake, maybe 25 years old, with the kind of confidence that comes from never having anything really bad happen to you yet. He had one of those mustaches that young guys grow to look older, and he kept talking about perfect weather conditions and how we'd get close enough to the summit to see the climber camps. Devin was already taking pictures before we even got in the plane, acting like this was the adventure of a lifetime. I was just trying not to think about how small the plane looked, how thin the metal seemed, how the whole thing bounced when the wind hit it. Jake did his safety briefing like he'd done it 1,000 times before, which I guess he had. He pointed out the emergency exits, showed us the oxygen masks, explained that we'd be flying at high altitude where the air gets thin. He said we might feel a little lightheaded, but that was normal. We took off around 10 in the morning, and I have to admit, once we were up there, it was beautiful. The glaciers spread out below us like rivers of white and blue ice, and the peaks of the Alaska Range stretched to the horizon in every direction. Denali itself loomed over everything else, this massive wall of rock and snow that seemed to go up forever. Jake narrated the whole tour through our headsets, pointing out different climbing routes and telling us about the mountain's history. He said hundreds of people have made it to the summit over the years, but dozens have died trying. Most of the bodies are never recovered, he said. They just stay up there, frozen in the ice and snow, preserved forever at high altitude. The mountain keeps them, Jake said, like it was just another interesting fact for tourists. Sometimes bodies emerge years later when the glaciers shift. A climber from the 70s might just appear one day, perfectly preserved, still wearing their old gear. Devin asked if he might see any of the bodies from the plane, and Jake said probably not. Most of them were in crevasses or covered by snow. But sometimes, he said, sometimes you could spot them if you knew where to look. We were circling at about 14,000 feet, following the West Buttress climbing route, when Jake suddenly went quiet. He stopped his tour guide patter and pointed down at the glacier below us. "That's weird," he said over the radio. "There's someone down there." I looked where he was pointing and saw a figure lying flat on the glacier, arms spread wide like they were making a snow angel. Even from our altitude, you could see it clearly against the white ice. "That definitely wasn't there yesterday," Jake said. "I fly this route 5 times a week. I'd remember seeing someone in that spot." Devin pressed his face against the window. "Are they okay? Shouldn't we call for help?" Jake circled lower for a better look. The figure was wearing a bright red parka. Old-fashioned looking, not like the modern climbing gear you see nowadays. It looked like something from a vintage magazine photo. "Climbers don't sleep exposed like that," Jake said, and I could hear tension creeping into his voice. "You'd freeze to death in minutes. Let me radio this in." He contacted the Park Service and reported a possible body on the glacier. The dispatcher asked him to mark the GPS coordinates and head back to base. They'd send a recovery team as soon as they could get a helicopter up there. We were banking away from the glacier when Devin said, "Wait, did that guy just move?" I looked back down, and the figure had changed position. The arms were now down at the sides instead of spread out wide. Jake saw it too. "That's not possible," he said, and his voice was shaking now. "We've been watching it the whole time. No one moved." He circled again, dropping even lower this time. The figure sat up smoothly and turned its head toward our plane, tracking our movement across the sky like it was watching us. "This isn't right," Jake said. He was swearing now, the professional tour, guide act completely gone. That was a body, had to be a body. Nothing can survive at that altitude in those conditions. The figure stood up without any struggle, no signs of distress or cold. It started walking across the glacier toward a nearby crevasse, moving way too fast for someone at 14,000 feet. Even experienced climbers move slowly up there, fighting for every breath in the thin air. Jake radioed the Park Service again, his voice high and panicked. "The body is moving," he said. "It stood up and it's walking around. I don't understand what I'm seeing here." The dispatcher asked if he was feeling hypoxic, if the altitude was affecting his judgment. Jake yelled back that all three of us saw it, that he was descending immediately. We lost sight of the figure as it disappeared into the crevasse. Jake dropped altitude fast, getting us away from the mountain as quickly as he could. None of us said much on the flight back to Talkeetna. Back at the airport, park rangers were waiting for us. They took statements from all three of us, and I could tell they thought we'd experienced some kind of altitude-induced hallucination. They kept asking about headaches, nausea, confusion. They seemed particularly focused on Jake, like maybe he'd pushed the plane too high too fast. But Jake insisted on reviewing the video from his plane's exterior camera. Every flight was recorded, he said, for safety and insurance purposes. The footage was crystal clear. It showed the figure lying motionless on the glacier, then sitting up, then standing and walking toward the crevasse, all in the span of about 2 minutes while we circled overhead. The rangers went completely silent watching that video. One of them, an older guy with gray hair, said quietly, "That's a Red Sierra Designs parka. They stopped making those in 1982. He pulled up a database on his laptop and showed us a PH, Oto from 1981. Ray Morrison, age 34, disappeared during a solo summit attempt. He was wearing that exact red parka in his file photo. His body was never found, the ranger said. Search teams looked for weeks. Now here he is, 37 years later, just standing up and walking around like no time passed at all." The rangers organized an immediate helicopter recovery mission, but when they reached the coordinates Jake had marked, they found nothing. No body, no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. The crevasse the figure walked into was searched with ropes and cameras. It went down 300 feet and was empty except for ancient ice. Devin and I flew home the next day. We were both completely rattled. Devin kept saying, "That guy was dead, right? He had to be dead. People don't survive 37 years on a glacier." 2 weeks later, Jake called me. He said 3 more flight-seeing pilots had reported seeing climbers in old-fashioned gear moving around on the mountain in areas where no living person could survive. The Park Service was keeping it quiet, but rangers were finding impossible things. Fresh footprints at 19,000 feet that led nowhere. Camps set up at altitudes that would kill you in hours. Voices on emergency radio frequencies calling for help in weather conditions that hadn't existed for decades. Jake said he'd stopped flying near Denali Summit. He'd take tourists to see the lower glaciers, but he refused to go above 12,000 feet anymore. Too many weird sightings, he said. Too many things that didn't make sense. I thought that was the end of it. I went back to my routine at the hospital, mopping floors and emptying trash. But the dreams started about a month later. Dreams where I was climbing Denali in my janitor uniform, still wearing my name tag and carrying my hospital keys. In the dreams, I could see myself from above, watching myself lie down in the snow and close my eyes. Last month, I got a call from a park ranger asking if I'd come to Anchorage to identify something they'd found on the mountain. They'd recovered a body at 16,000 feet, male, mid-30s, perfectly preserved, wearing jeans and a hospital janitor uniform with a Fairbanks Medical Center patch. The body had my name tag on it. Marcus Rodriguez, Environmental Services. It was carrying my hospital ID badge, current and active. I told them that was impossible because I was alive and standing right there talking to them. The ranger said, "We know. That's why we're calling." I drove to Anchorage to see it. The body looked exactly like me. Same face, same scars on my hands from years of cleaning work, same tattoo on my left forearm that I got when I turned 18. The medical examiner ran DNA tests. They confirmed it was me, genetically identical. The ranger told me there's a theory among long-time Alaska search and rescue teams. Denali doesn't just kill climbers, he said. It keeps them, and sometimes it sends them back wrong. He said in the past 5 years they've found 14 bodies on Denali that matched living people. Always people who'd never climbed the mountain, never even been to Alaska in some cases. As if Denali was collecting copies, preparing for something. Last week, Devin called me panicking. He'd been tagged in a photo on social media, someone's climbing expedition from 2 weeks ago. In the background of the photo, clearly visible at 18,000 feet, was Devin in his Seattle Seahawks jacket, waving at the camera. Devin's never climbed anything in his life. He was at work in Seattle the day that photo was taken, sitting in his office building writing code. But there he was, impossible and smiling, on the mountain. I haven't slept well since seeing my own body in that medical examiner's office. Last night I had the dream again, but this time it was different. This time I didn't just watch myself lie down in the snow. This time I felt the cold seeping through. My uniform. Felt my breath getting shorter and shorter until it stopped completely. When I woke up, my boots were covered in ice, and there was frost on my bedroom window in the shape of the mountain. I know that Denali has already taken something from me, some future version or alternate version or shadow version. It's waiting up there with all the others, all the people who never climbed but somehow died on that mountain anyway. Someday I'll go to sleep and won't wake up in Fairbanks. I'll wake up on the mountain, in the cold and the thin air, surrounded by all my copies, and we'll all start walking together toward the summit that no living person can reach. But the dead climb forever, and Denali always gets its full count, whether you go willingly or whether it just takes you. The mountain doesn't care which. My name is Denise Harper, and I've been managing the night shift at Sudsy's Laundromat in Wasilla for 12 years. I work 6 p.m. to 2 a.m., 6 days a week, handling the commercial accounts, hotels, restaurants, medical facilities. It's steady work, nothing exciting, but it pays the bills and lets me be home during the day when my daughter Emma was growing up. I've seen all kinds of weird stuff working nights. Drunk customers, break-in attempts, equipment failures in the middle of the night. But what happened last August on the Alaska Railroad changed everything I thought I knew about what's possible in this world. Emma had just turned 19 and got accepted to University of Alaska Fairbanks. I was so proud of her. First person in our family to go to college. When it came time to move her into the dorms, we had a choice. Drive the long route through Anchorage and up the Parks Highway, or take the Alaska Railroad from Wasilla to Fairbanks. Emma had never been on a train, and honestly, neither had I. The overnight train leaves at 8 p.m. and arrives around 8 a.m., 12 hours through some of the most beautiful wilderness in Alaska. The train station in Wasilla is small, just a platform and a tiny waiting room. We bought tickets for a private sleeper compartment with 2 bunks, cost extra, but I wanted Emma to be comfortable. The train pulled in right on time, blue and gold cars stretching back into the evening light. The conductor, a friendly guy named Dave, checked our tickets and showed us to our car. Our compartment was cozy. 2 narrow bunks, a small table, and a big window. The train was only half full, mostly tourists with cameras and guidebooks, a few locals heading north for work or family visits. As we pulled away from the station, Emma pressed her face to the window, watching the mountains and forests roll by. The dining car served decent food, and we sat there, eating while the sun set over the peaks, painting everything orange and pink. The first few hours were perfect. Emma read a book while I watched the darkness settle over the wilderness. Trees flashed past the window, mile after mile of spruce and birch. Around 11 p.m., Emma fell asleep in her bunk. I stayed awake, looking out at the black forest. There's something peaceful about train travel. The steady rhythm, the gentle swaying, the feeling of moving through the world without effort. Around midnight, we stopped at a small station. I couldn't see the name in the darkness, but a group of people got on, maybe 10 or 12 passengers. What struck me as odd was how they were dressed. Heavy winter coats, thick fur hats, wool scarves wrapped around their faces. It was August, and even though Alaska nights get cool, it wasn't cold enough for that kind of gear. An old woman in a fox fur coat walked past our compartment. She glanced in through the window, and our eyes met for a second. Then she kept walking toward the back of the train. Something about her look bothered me, but I couldn't put my finger on what. I tried to sleep, but I kept hearing footsteps in the corridor outside, back and forth, like someone pacing. The train swayed gently, but those footsteps were steady, purposeful. I figured it was just restless passengers or crew making their rounds. Around 1 a.m. I heard singing. A woman's voice, somewhere behind us, singing what sounded like a Russian folk song. The melody was haunting, mournful, with words I couldn't understand. It wasn't loud, but it carried clearly through the train cars. I cracked open our compartment door and looked out. The corridor was empty, dimly lit by small wall lamps. The singing was coming from the car behind us. I hesitated, then stepped out and walked back through the next car where passengers were sleeping in regular seats, some snoring softly. I pushed through the door into the dining car and stopped cold. The dining car was full of people, all wearing those heavy winter clothes I'd seen earlier. They sat at tables with empty plates in front of them, not eating, not talking, just sitting in complete silence. The air was thick and cold. I could see my breath forming little clouds. At the far end of the car, the old woman in the fox fur coat was the one singing. Her voice echoed strangely in the space, and everyone else sat perfectly still, watching her. No one moved. No one blinked. I started to back out slowly, and that's when the old woman stopped singing mid-verse. She looked directly at me and smiled. Her teeth were too sharp, too white, and her eyes were completely black. No whites, no pupils, just solid black from lid to lid. I backed out of the dining car and ran to our compartment, my heart pounding. Emma stirred when I came in, mumbling, "What's wrong, Mom?" I told her to be quiet and stay in her bunk. I locked our door and sat on my bed listening. The footsteps in the corridor got louder, more frequent. I could hear doors opening and closing like someone was checking each compartment. Our door handle turned slowly, testing the lock. Then came a soft knock. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps. Over and over. Emma was crying quietly. I held her close and we waited in silence until the knocking finally stopped around 2 a.m. At 3 a.m. the train stopped moving. No station announcement, no lights outside, just stopped dead in the middle of nowhere. I looked out our window and saw we were in thick forest. In the darkness between the trees I could see small fires, dozens of them, like a camp scattered through the woods. The train sat there for 20 minutes. I watched figures moving around those fires, and some of them started walking toward the train. They climbed aboard, and I could feel the train getting heavier, the suspension creaking with new weight. More footsteps filled the corridors. The train started moving again. When I peeked out our dual cinema, the corridor was packed with people in winter clothes, standing shoulder to shoulder, all facing the same direction. None of them moved or spoke. They just stood there, swaying with the train's movement. The temperature had dropped so much I could see my breath inside our heated compartment. Emma whispered, "Mom, what's happening?" I had no answer. This was impossible, but it was happening. I told her to stay quiet no matter what. We sat in our locked compartment, listening to the silence outside. Dozens of people standing in the corridor, not making a sound. Around 5 a.m. I heard the door at the end of our car open. A conductor's voice called out, "Tickets, please. Tickets." But it wasn't Dave's voice. This voice was wrong. Too deep, with an accent I didn't recognize. I heard compartment doors opening one by one, getting closer to ours. The conductor saying thank you after each one, but the passengers never spoke back. Our door was next. The handle turned even though it was locked, and the door swung open. Standing there was a man in an old-fashioned conductor's uniform like something from the 1940s. His skin was gray, his lips were blue, and his breath came out in white clouds. He held out his hand and said, "Tickets, please." I showed him our tickets with shaking hands. He looked at them and frowned. "These are the wrong tickets," he said. "These are for the living train." "What?" I stammered. "This is the Alaska Railroad to Fairbanks." He shook his head slowly. "This is the winter train. This train doesn't go to Fairbanks. This train goes where the tracks used to run before they moved them." "What do you mean?" "In 1948, there was an avalanche," he said, his voice echoing strangely. "The train was buried. 73 passengers and crew died. We've been running this route every night since, picking up the ones who don't know they're dead." Emma grabbed my arm. I pulled her toward the door, but the corridor was packed with those silent passengers, blocking our way. They were ice cold to touch and didn't react when I pushed against them. "You can't leave until we reach the end of the line," the conductor said. "Everyone stays until their stop." I forced my way through the crowd, dragging Emma. The passengers were like frozen statues, not resisting but not moving aside either. We made it to the door between cars and burst outside onto the small platform. The train was moving fast through the dark forest. I found the emergency brake cord and pulled it with everything I had. The train screeched and slowed. I grabbed Emma's hand. "We have to jump," I told her. "Mom, no!" "Trust me. On 3. 1, 2, 3. We jumped off the slowing train, hitting the ground hard and rolling into the brush beside the tracks. Branches scratched our faces and arms. We lay there in the darkness, watching the train slow to a stop about 100 yards ahead. Through the windows, I could see all those passengers pressed against the glass, looking back at us. The train sat there for 5 minutes. Then it slowly started moving again, picking up speed and disappeared around a curve. We were alone in the Alaskan wilderness. We started walking along the tracks, hoping we were heading north toward Fairbanks. My phone had no signal. Emma's was dead. We walked for hours in the cold darkness, following the railroad ties. At dawn, we reached a small maintenance station. There was an old landline phone, and I called for help. Alaska state troopers picked us up an hour later. We told them everything. The passengers in winter clothes, the conductor jumping off the train. They said they'd check with the railroad. The railroad company said their overnight train had arrived in Fairbanks on schedule at 8 a.m. with all passengers accounted for, including me and Emma, who never got off at any point during the journey. They showed us security footage from Fairbanks Station. There we were, Emma and me, getting off the train that morning call, acting our luggage, walking into the terminal, except we weren't there. We were sitting in a state trooper station 200 miles away, covered in dirt and scratches from jumping off a moving train. When Emma started college the next week, she checked her phone and found a voicemail from herself, left at 8:15 a.m. the day we jumped. Her own voice saying, "Mom and I made it to Fairbanks safe. The train was great. Talk soon." But Emma never left that message. Neither did I. Whatever got off that train in Fairbanks and walked around wearing our faces, using our voices, moving our luggage, it knew exactly how to be us. Now Emma calls me every night from her dorm to make sure I'm really me. I do the same. We both know that somewhere out there, 2 versions of us finished that train ride to the end of the line. They're still riding the winter train through territory that doesn't exist anymore. Every night at 8 p.m. when the Alaska Railroad departs from Wasilla, somewhere on the tracks between here and Fairbanks, a second train runs on rails that were buried in 1948. If you get on by mistake, if you're tired or confused or just unlucky, you'll ride with the frozen dead through a landscape that time forgot. You'll never reach your destination. Something else will arrive in your place and walk around in your life, and no one will ever know the difference. Because the winter train always delivers its passengers, one way or another. My name is Chris Martinez, and I've been working night shifts at Carr's Safeway in Anchorage for 8 years. Stocking shelves, rotating inventory, dealing with delivery trucks at 3 a.m. Nothing exciting, but it pays the bills. I know every product code by heart, can stack a pallet in under 20 minutes, and I've handled my share of weird late-night customers. I thought the strangest thing I'd ever see was finding someone's dentures in the cereal aisle. But what happened last summer on Lake Iliamna changed everything I thought I knew about what's really out there in Alaska's wilderness. It started with a phone call from Jake Kowalski, my best friend since we were kids growing up in Eagle River. Jake had spent the last 5 years building up a small commercial fishing operation, working his way up from deckhand to boat owner. He'd finally gotten permits to fish Lake Iliamna during the 2-week salmon season, something he'd been trying to get for 3 years. "Chris, I need a deckhand," Jake said over the phone. 2 weeks, $3,000 cash. All you gotta do is help with the nets and keep the fish sorted. $3,000 was more than I made in a month at the grocery store. I had vacation time saved up, and Jake was offering me a chance to make real money for once. "When do we leave?" I asked. Lake Iliamna sits about 200 miles southwest of Anchorage, and it's the biggest lake in Alaska. Over 1,000 square miles of water, some parts more than 1,000 feet deep. The drive takes about 4 hours on rough roads, and when we got there, I understood why commercial fishing permits were so hard to get. The lake was huge, stretching to the horizon like an inland ocean. Jake had a 24-foot Alumaweld with a 250 horsepower Yamaha outboard, all the commercial fishing gear, and enough supplies for 2 weeks. We set up camp at a lodge near Iliamna village, where the locals were fraught. Friendly, but gave us some weird looks when they heard we were fishing the deep water. "You boys be careful out there," said an older native man named Tom who worked at the lodge. "That lake's got things in it that don't belong." Jake laughed it off. "Probably just giant sturgeon or seals that swim up from Bristol Bay," he said. "Nothing supernatural about big fish." But Tom shook his head. "My grandfather's grandfather told stories about something in the deep water. Something that's been there longer than people have been fishing. It's not a fish." The first 3 days were amazing. We launched the boat each morning before sunrise, and the water was so clear you could see 30 feet down into blue-green emptiness. Our fish finder showed schools of salmon and huge lake trout, and we were pulling in more fish than I'd ever seen. Jake's nets were working perfectly, and we were filling our holds with premium catch. On the 4th day, we decided to try the really deep water about 3 miles from shore. Jake said that's where the biggest fish would be, down in the cold water near the thermal layers. We were setting our nets when the fish finder went absolutely crazy. The sonar display lit up like Christmas, showing something massive passing underneath us. The screen registered it as over 60 feet long, swimming steady at about 200 feet deep. The signature was solid, not a school of fish, but one enormous object moving through the water. "Equipment malfunction," Jake said, but his voice wasn't confident. "Nothing that big lives in fresh water. Biggest fish in here might be a 10-foot sturgeon." Then our boat lurched hard to the right. Something had bumped us from below, not a gentle brush, but a solid impact that nearly threw me overboard. The boat rocked so violently that our tackle box slid across the deck and crashed into the side. Jake grabbed the wheel to steady us, and we both looked over the edge into the water. The lake around our boat was churning like something huge was moving just below the surface. For maybe 3 seconds, I saw it clearly. A massive, pale body gliding underneath us, smooth like a whale, but with what looked like armor plates running along its back. It was definitely alive, definitely moving with purpose, and it was bigger than our boat. "We're heading back," Jake said, his face white as paper. "Right now." But when he turned the key, the engine just clicked. He tried again. Nothing. The battery was fine, the fuel gauge showed 3/4 full, but the motor was completely dead. We drifted in perfectly calm water, and that's when we noticed our nets. They were moving, not floating freely, but being pulled down in a steady, deliberate motion. No fighting, no thrashing like fish would do, just a constant downward drag. "Cut the lines," Jake said, grabbing a knife from the tackle box. But when he tried to reach the main line, the boat tilted toward the water. Whatever was pulling our nets was strong enough to drag a 24-foot boat. I grabbed my own knife and sawed through the thick rope. It snapped with a sound like a gunshot, and the boat rocked back to level. But as we watched, our expensive nets disappeared into the deep water, and wrapped in them was something huge, thrashing not to escape, but pulling the nets deeper on purpose. The water around our boat started bubbling, and then the smell hit us. Rotting fish mixed with something chemical, like ammonia and decay, so strong it made my eyes water. I'd smelled spoiled fish before at the grocery store, but this was different. Wrong. That's when we saw them floating up. Dozens of salmon, all dead, all with the same horrible injuries. Their bellies were ripped open and completely empty, like something had scooped out their internal organs with surgical precision. Jake got on the radio. "Mayday, Mayday, this is fishing vessel Northern Dream. We need immediate assistance on Lake Iliamna. Coordinates?" It took 40 minutes for the Park Service boat to reach us. 40 minutes of drifting in that stinking water, watching more dead fish float to the surface, all of them gutted the same way. When Ranger Patterson finally towed us back to shore, his first question was whether we'd been drinking. "No, sir," Jake said. "Stone sober, something big hit our boat from underneath, dragged our nets down, and killed all these fish." Patterson's expression changed from skeptical to serious when he saw the dead salmon. "You boys need to come to my office," he said. At the ranger station, Patterson pulled out a thick file folder marked Lake Incidents, Confidential. Inside were reports going back 50 years, commercial fishermen, researchers, even some tourists, all describing the same thing. Something massive in the deep water, boats being bumped or rocked, nets dragged down, and always the dead fish with their insides removed. "We don't advertise this," Patterson said. "Tourism and commercial fishing are too important to the local economy. But you're not the first to see something out there." He showed us photos from a research expedition in 1999. Underwater cameras had captured images at 400 feet depth, blurry but unmistakable. Something at least 50 feet long, with multiple pairs of flipper-like appendages and a triangular head. But the most disturbing part was the skin. It was translucent, and you could see what looked like organs or systems moving inside, glowing faintly with blue-green bioluminescence. Marine biologists from the University of Alaska reviewed these images, Patterson said. They couldn't identify it as any known species, not a fish, not a mammal, not anything in the scientific literature. The research team had tried to tag it with a tracking device, but when the divers got close, 3 of them started having seizures underwater. They had to emergency surface, and 2 divers were hospitalized with symptoms doctors. Tours couldn't explain. Temporary blindness, bleeding from their ears, extreme disorientation that lasted for days. All the divers reported the same thing. When they approached the creature, they heard a sound inside their heads, not through their ears. A vibration that made their brains hurt, like the creature was somehow communicating directly with their nervous systems. The project was shut down and classified after that. "Locals know to stay away from the deep water," Patterson said. "But we can't tell tourists because it would destroy the fishing industry. People come here from around the world to fish Lake Iliamna." Jake and I packed up that night. We forfeited the rest of our permit and decided to head back to Anchorage immediately. As we loaded our gear into Jake's truck, we saw something that made us move even faster. In the water near the dock, maybe 20 feet from shore and about 10 feet of water, something huge glided past. We couldn't see the body, just the displacement wave it created. But whatever it was had to be at least 30 feet long and somehow flattened enough to fit in shallow water. We drove back to Anchorage at 2 a.m., not talking much, just wanting to get away from that lake. Jake sold his boat the next week and quit commercial fishing entirely. He got a job at a construction company and said he was done with the water. But 2 months later, Jake started having problems. He'd wake up in the middle of the night choking, saying he was drowning, but he was completely dry and lying in his bed. He'd have nosebleeds that wouldn't stop, and he started hearing that vibration sound, the same thing the divers described, especially near running water. Showers, sinks, even when it rained. Doctors couldn't find anything wrong with him. Blood tests, brain scans, everything came back normal. But Jake said he could feel it in his head, a presence, like something was watching him through water. He couldn't take baths anymore, couldn't even wash dishes without feeling like something was calling to him. He moved to Arizona trying to get away from ate her entirely. No lakes, no ocean, just desert. But it didn't help. His roommate told me Jake would fill his bathtub and stare at it for hours, saying something was calling him back to the water. Last month, Jake's roommate called me from Phoenix. Jake had disappeared. Police found his car at Roosevelt Lake, a reservoir outside the city. His clothes were folded neatly on the shore, his phone and wallet placed on top like he'd planned it. Search and rescue dragged the lake for 3 days but never found his body. But the divers reported something strange. At 60 feet depth, they found a trail in the silt, like something large had dragged itself across the lake bottom toward the deepest part. The trail was 40 feet long and 6 feet wide, and at the end was a depression where something had been lying. The silt around the depression was crystallized, like it had been frozen or chemically altered. Arizona Fish and Game sent samples to a lab, and the results came back inconclusive. The silt contained organic compounds that don't exist naturally, amino acids in combinations that don't match any known life form. I got a package last week with no return address. Inside was a USB drive with video footage dated the day Jake disappeared. The video was from someone's boat on Roosevelt Lake, just tourists filming their fishing trip, but in the background you can clearly see a figure walking into the water. It's Jake. I'd recognize him anywhere. He walks steadily into deeper water until he's neck deep. Then he stops and looks directly at the camera. His expression is completely blank, and then he opens his mouth impossibly wide, like his jaw unhinges, and he sinks straight down like something pulled him from below. The video ends there, but I've watched it 50 times. In the last frame, you can see the water where Jake sank, and just below the surface, there's something huge moving up toward him. Something with that same translucent skin glowing faintly green. I know it followed him from Lake Iliamna, or maybe it was always in every deep water, waiting. Jake heard it calling and couldn't resist anymore. And now, every time I take a shower, I hear it too. That vibration inside my skull, growing stronger each day. I'm afraid to go near any water deeper than a puddle because I know it's hunting me too. Whatever lives in Lake Iliamna isn't unique. It's everywhere. Deep water touches darkness, and it collects people who've seen it. One day I'll hear the call too loud to ignore, and I'll walk into the ocean and never come back up. That's why I'm telling this story now, while I still can. Before the call gets too strong to resist. My name is Tom Mitchell, and I've been a long-haul truck driver for 22 years now. I'm 44, and I've been running freight between Anchorage and the lower 48 through Canada for the last 15 years. That's over 1 million miles on some of the most dangerous roads in North America. I've seen everything. Black ice that'll flip an 80,000-pound rig like a toy, blizzards that shut down entire highways for days, and wildlife that can total your truck in a heartbeat. The Alaska Highway is 1,400 miles of mostly empty road through some of the most remote wilderness you can imagine. When I tell people what I do, they think it's just driving, but it's not. You're hauling critical supplies to communities that depend on truckers like me. Medicine, food, fuel, stuff people need to survive. Miss a delivery because you're scared of some weather, and people suffer. That's the kind of responsibility that keeps you honest about what's really dangerous out there. I've driven through everything Mother Nature can throw at you. I've had grizzly bears circle my truck at rest stops. I've been stuck in whiteout conditions where you can't see past your hood ornament. I've had my engine freeze solid at 60 below and had to sleep in my cab for 2 days waiting for a tow. But what happened last October changed everything I thought I knew about what's really dangerous on that highway. I was hauling a full load of canned goods from Anchorage down to Seattle, about 40,000 pounds of cargo worth maybe 80 grand. It was a routine run I'd done hundreds of times before. October's always tricky on the Alaska Highway because that's when winter starts setting in for real. Temperatures drop fast, and you get your first real storms of the season. I'd left Anchorage around noon, planning to drive straight through to make my delivery deadline. My rig is a 2019 Peterbilt 579 with a 15-liter Cummins engine, reliable. Truck that's never let me down. I keep it maintained better than most people keep their cars because when you're 200 miles from the nearest town, mechanical failure isn't just inconvenient, it's life-threatening. The first 600 miles went smooth. Good weather, light traffic, making good time. I stopped at the regular truck stops, Talk, Destruction Bay, Haynes Junction, grabbed coffee, checked my load, did my mandatory inspections. Everything normal. The section I was approaching around 2 a.m. is what we call the dead zone. It's an 80-mile stretch through northern British Columbia where there's absolutely nothing. No towns, no gas stations, no cell phone coverage, just trees and darkness on both sides of the highway. Even the trucking companies warn you about this section. Keep your fuel tank full. Carry extra food and water. Tell dispatch exactly when you're entering and when you expect to exit. It was about 20 degrees below freezing that night, which is normal for October up there. Clear sky, no wind, good road conditions. My headlights were cutting through the darkness just fine, and I was making steady time at about 65 miles an hour. I had the CB radio on, but there wasn't much chatter, just the occasional trucker checking in with someone behind or ahead of them. I was about 40 miles into the dead zone when I saw him. My headlights caught someone standing on the shoulder of the road, thumb out, hitchhiking, just standing there in the middle of nowhere at 2 a.m. in freezing cold. Now, I don't pick up hitchhikers. It's company policy, it's insurance policy, and it's common sense. Too many drivers have been robbed, attacked, or worse. But this wasn't a normal situation. This was a young guy, maybe early 20s, wearing just jeans and a light jacket. Completely wrong clothing for October in northern BC where it was well below freezing. This kid would die of exposure out here, and a question about it. You can't survive dressed like that in those temperatures, especially with the wind chill from vehicles passing by. I started slowing down, checking my mirrors, and pulled over about 50 feet past him. I put on my hazard lights and watched in my side mirror as he jogged up to the passenger side of my cab. Something felt wrong immediately. His movements were too smooth, too fast, like he was gliding over the ground instead of running. And he got to my truck way faster than he should have. I'd stopped 50 feet away, but he reached my door in maybe 3 seconds. He knocked on the passenger window and smiled at me. Normal smile, friendly face, nothing obviously wrong. I rolled down the window and asked where he was headed. South, he said. Just that one word, in a completely flat voice. No emotion, no gratitude, no relief that someone had stopped to help him. I told him to hop in. He climbed into the cab, and that's when I noticed he wasn't breathing hard. He'd just jogged 50 feet in freezing cold air, but he wasn't winded at all. No visible breath in the cold air, no panting, nothing. Actually, watching him in the dim light from my dashboard, I didn't see him breathing at all. His chest wasn't moving up and down like it should be. I pulled back onto the highway and started driving. We went maybe 5 minutes in complete silence. Finally, I asked him how long he'd been stranded out there. He turned to look at me, and that same flat smile never changed. I've been walking this road for a very long time, he said. I asked where he was coming from, and he said, north, in that same emotionless voice. By now, I was getting seriously uncomfortable. Something was very wrong with this situation. I glanced over at him again and noticed his clothes. They had no dirt on them, no wear, no signs that he'd been walking along a muddy highway shoulder. His sneakers were pristine white, like he'd just taken them out of the box. Then I saw his hands. They were resting on his knees, and the skin was gray. Not pale, not cold-looking. Gray, like ash. And tools. His fingernails were completely black. Not dirty black, but black, like they'd been painted or dyed. I made up some excuse about needing to check my cargo straps and pulled over. I told him I'd just be a minute and climbed down from the cab. I walked around to the back of my trailer, pretending to check my load, and pulled out my cell phone to call 911. No signal. Of course. I was still in the dead zone. When I walked back toward the cab, the passenger door was open and the kid was standing outside. But he'd moved wrong. I'd looked away for maybe 3 seconds to check my phone, and somehow he'd gotten out of the truck and moved to the front of it. He was standing directly in front of my truck now, right in my headlights, and I got my first really good look at him. His eyes reflected the light like an animal's eyes. yellowish green, glowing in my headlights. And when he smiled at me, I could see his teeth were wrong too. Too sharp, too many of them. I told him I'd changed my mind, and he needed to find another ride. I started backing toward my driver's door. He tilted his head at me, but not like a person would. He tilted it almost 45 degrees to the side, way further than any human neck should bend. And he said, "You can't leave me here, Tom. You already let me in." I never told him my name. I jumped into my driver's seat, locked both doors, and threw the truck into gear. As I pulled away, I looked in my side mirror to see what he was doing. He was running after my truck. Not jogging, not walking, running at a full sprint. And he was keeping up with me even as I accelerated to 40, 50, 60 miles per hour. His legs were moving, but wrong. He was taking strides that had to be 15 feet long, covering ground like he was barely touching it. And through it all, he kept that same flat smile on his face. I floored the accelerator, pushing my truck up to 75 miles per hour, which is about as fast as I dare go on that highway at night. Finally, he fell back and disappeared from my mirrors. I didn't slow down for the next 100 miles. At the next truck stop, I was shaking so bad, I could barely hold my coffee cup. The night attendant was an older guy named Frank who'd been working that route for 20 years. I told him what had happened, expecting him to think I was crazy or hallucinating from fatigue. Instead, his face went completely serious. He asked me exactly where I'd picked up the hitchhiker, and when I described the location, he nodded slowly. "You picked up the walker," he said. "Drivers report seeing him every few months. Nobody knows what he is, but he sure isn't human." Frank took me to a back office and showed me a bulletin board covered with warnings. Posted notices from trucking companies, the RCMP, even some American DOT offices. All of them warning drivers not to pick up hitchhikers on that specific 10-mile stretch of highway. There were printed reports going back 30 years, all describing the same person. Young guy, light jacket, thumb out, always in the exact same area. Drivers who'd picked him up all reported the same things I'd experienced. No breathing, gray skin, eyes that reflected light, and the overwhelming feeling that they'd made a terrible mistake. Frank said, "Nobody knows what happens if you give him a full ride to wherever he's going. Every smart driver drops him off or leaves him behind. But there have been 3 drivers over the years who didn't." He showed me case files from the RCMP. 3 separate incidents where long-haul truckers had disappeared on the Alaska highway in that area. In each case, they'd found the trucks abandoned with the engine still running and the driver's door hanging open. No sign of the drivers anywhere. In one case from 2003, they'd found the truck's interior covered in some kind of black residue, sticky, thick, smelled like burned hair and hot metal. They'd sent samples to labs in Vancouver and Toronto for analysis. The tests came back saying it was biological material but not from a unknown organism. I asked Frank what the theory was about what had happened to those drivers. "Officially, the RCMP calls them wilderness disappearances," he said. "Off the record, they think something hunts that highway. The local indigenous people have stories about creatures called adlet, things that look human but are predators, mimics that copy human form to get close to their prey." I finished my coffee and got back on the road, thinking I was done with the whole experience. But 50 miles later, I started smelling something in my cab. That same smell Frank had described from the case files, burned hair and hot metal. When I checked the passenger seat, there was a black handprint pressed into the fabric. The handprint was too large, with fingers that were too long. Where it had touched the seat, the fabric was stiff and discolored, like it had been chemically burned. I pulled over and tried scrubbing it with everything I had in my truck, but the smell wouldn't go away, and that handprint stayed visible no matter what I did. 2 weeks later, I was running the same route again. Company policy: you take the runs you're assigned, and this was my regular route. At 2 a.m., in that exact same stretch of highway, I saw him again, standing in the exact same spot where I'd first picked him up, thumb out, smiling, wearing the same light jacket like it wasn't 20 below freezing. This time I didn't stop. I accelerated past him, but as I went by, I looked in my mirror. He was turning to watch my truck pass, and his head rotated a full 180 degrees without his body moving at all. Since then, I've driven that route maybe 20 times. I see him every single time. Always the same spot. Always 2 a.m., always smiling and waiting with his thumb out. Other drivers report the same thing now. Like once you stop for him, he marks you somehow, and you'll see him forever. Frank at the truck stop keeps a log of drivers who've had encounters. There are 47 names on that list now, and every single one of them reports seeing the walker on every trip through that area. Last month, a Hermosillo driver I know named Carl Hendricks said he'd heard all the stories about the walker, but he didn't believe them. Carl's been driving for 25 years, tough guy, doesn't scare easy. He said he was going to stop next time he saw the hitchhiker just to prove it was all bullshit trucker stories. Carl's truck was found 3 days later at a rest area 200 miles south of where the walker appears. Engine still running, Carl's coffee still warm in the cup holder, driver's door hanging open just like those other cases. They found Carl's wallet and phone on the driver's seat, but Carl was gone. When the investigators checked the sleeper berth, they found that black residue covering the entire mattress. But they also found something else. Carl's clothes. His jeans, his jacket, his boots, his belt, all of them empty and deflated, like they'd been peeled off inside out. And inside the jacket, they found handprints. Dozens of them, all too large with fingers too long, pressed into the fabric from the inside. Like something had worn Carl's skin like a suit, then discarded it when it was done. Now when I drive that highway, I see the walker every time, still hitchhiking in the exact same spot, still smiling. But sometimes there are two of them standing there, and the second one is wearing a jacket exactly like Carl's. I think it's getting bigger, learning, spreading, collecting drivers one by one. One night I'm going to be too tired or too curious or just too human to drive past. I'll stop, and whatever that thing is will climb into my truck, and I'll be the next skin it wears while it hunts for more drivers. The Alaska highway will have one more smiling hitchhiker waiting in the dark. And someday, maybe, it'll be enough of them to stop every truck that comes through. I still drive that route, it's my job, and people depend on the freight I carry. But every time I see those headlights in the distance at 2 a.m. standing there with their thumbs out, I floor the accelerator and don't look in my mirrors, because I know that someday I might not be fast enough to get away. My name is Sandra Martinez, and I've been a postal worker for 8 years. I deliver mail and sort packages in Nome, Alaska. Not the most exciting job, but it's steady work that pays the bills. I've walked through blizzards, delivered Christmas presents in -40 weather, and even helped rescue a neighbor whose car broke down on the ice road. In Alaska, postal workers are more than mail carriers. We're lifelines for isolated communities. But what happened last February in Nome changed everything I thought I knew about what lives under the ice in Alaska. Some things should stay buried in the frozen ground forever. Nome sits right on the edge of nowhere. 3,800 people perched on the Bering Sea coast, surrounded by endless tundra and sea ice. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and we all depend on each other to survive the brutal winters. From November through May, the sea ice stretches for miles from shore, thick enough to drive trucks on. People use it for ice fishing, snowmobiling, and as a highway to reach remote cabins and camps. When the temperature hits -30, and we only get 4 hours of daylight in December, that ice becomes our world. I drive a postal service Jeep with chains on the tires and a GPS that barely works half the time. My route covers the whole town, from the fancy houses near the hospital to the trailer park by the airport. I carry pepper spray, emergency flares, and a satellite phone because getting stuck alone in an Alaska winter can kill you fast. The Postal Service trains us for extreme weather, medical emergencies, and even bear encounters. I thought I was ready for anything. Last February was the worst winter I'd ever seen. The cold was so intense it hurt to breathe, and the wind never stopped howling. Even the locals were complaining, and these are people who've lived their whole lives in the Arctic. That's when Plus started reporting something strange in the ice. At first, it was just whispers at the coffee shop and grocery store. Ice fishermen saying they saw movement under the ice that wasn't fish or seals. snowmobilers finding weird trails in the ice that looked like something had burrowed just under the surface. I didn't pay much attention. Alaska is full of stories, and long winters make people see things that aren't there. But then I was delivering mail to Mary Kanguk, an elderly Inupiaq woman who lives in a small house on the edge of town. Her backyard faces directly onto the sea ice, and she's lived there for 70 years. When I knocked on her door with a package, she invited me in for coffee and said she had something to show me. We walked to her back fence, and she pointed at the ice. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just the normal white expanse stretching to the horizon. Then she handed me binoculars, and I saw them. Lines in the ice, raised about 6 inches above the surface, crisscrossing in every direction. Some were as thick as my arm, creating patterns that stretched as far as I could see. "Iceworms," Mary said, her voice completely serious. "They're migrating. This happens every 40 years, but people forget." I laughed and told her that iceworms are tiny, maybe an inch long, and they live in glaciers, not sea ice. I'd learned about them in school, but Mary's expression didn't change. "Not these iceworms. These are the old ones, the ones that were here before humans." She explained that according to her grandmother's stories, every few decades something wakes up in the deep ice and migrates to shore to feed. They sleep in the ocean floor, in the ice that never melts, and when they wake up, they're hungry. I thought she was confused or telling old legends. But that night, the local news reported something that made my blood run cold. A fisherman named Tom Erickson had drilled through 18 inches of ice and dropped his line, and something had grabbed it from below, not eaten the bait, grabbed the actual fishing line. When Tom tried to pull it up, the line snapped. A few seconds later, the ice around his fishing hole cracked with a sound like gunshots, and something burst through. Tom described it as white, segmented like a worm, as thick as his leg, and at least 6 feet of it came out of the water before it slid back down. Tom had managed to record it on his phone. The video was shaky and blurry, but it showed something pale thrashing in the dark water. The news interviewed a marine biologist from the university who said it was probably a bearded seal, but you could tell from her voice that she didn't believe her own explanation. Over the next week, more sightings came in. People saw them at night, moving under the ice when the lights from town reflected off the surface. They moved fast, undulating like snakes, and they ranged from 6 feet to what some people claimed was over 20 feet long. The city council held an emergency meeting and told everyone to stay off the ice until they could investigate, but that's impossible in Nome. The ice is our highway in winter. I kept delivering mail, but every day I saw more of those trails in the ice. They were getting closer to shore, and the patterns were changing. At first they seemed random, but after a week the trails formed geometric shapes, circles, spirals, grids, like they were organized or communicating somehow. Then people's dogs started disappearing, not running away, disappearing from yards, some even taken from chains or kennels. Search parties found blood on the ice, drag marks leading to holes that hadn't been there before. The holes were perfectly round, 8 inches in diameter, going straight down through 20 inches of ice. When you looked down them, you couldn't see the bottom, just darkness. One night, my neighbor's husky started barking at 3 in the morning. Bear was a good dog, quiet most of the time, so when he barked, it meant something was wrong. I looked out my bedroom window and saw something that made no sense. The snow in my backyard was moving, not from wind, but something underneath pushing up and creating a raised line moving toward my neighbor's fence. I watched it reach the chain-link fence. The fence posts started shaking, metal creaking in the cold. Then one post snapped and fell over, and the thing went through. Bear stopped barking suddenly, and I heard a sound I'll never forget, a wet crunch, like bones breaking, and then complete silence. In the morning, Bear was gone. The kennel was torn apart, thick metal wire bent and twisted. There was a trail in the snow leading to a hole in the ice 50 feet away, a perfect circle cut through 2 feet of solid ice. The city finally brought in state wildlife officers and scientists from the University of Alaska. They set up equipment to monitor the ice, cameras, sonar, underwater microphones. They dropped a waterproof camera through one of the holes, and what they recorded wasn't released to the public. But I know someone who saw the footage. The camera showed them, Dozens of them, swimming in slow circles under the ice at about 40 feet depth. Each one was 15 to 20 feet long, pale white with segmented bodies like giant earthworms. They had no visible eyes or mouth on the front end. But the rear end, that's where the mouth was. A circular opening ringed with what looked like teeth or hooks, constantly opening and closing as they filter-fed something from the water. The most disturbing part was when one approached the camera. It had bristles or spines along its segments, and each spine moved independently, reaching and grasping. It pulled itself toward the camera with those spines, and when they tried to retrieve the equipment, the lens was covered in thick mucus, and the metal housing was corroded like it had been soaked in acid. The official statement said they were investigating an invasive species bloom, and the ice was temporarily off limits. But nobody explained what the species actually was, and the scientists packed up their equipment and left town within 3 days. That night, the power went out in Nome, the whole town, completely dark. It took 6 hours to restore electricity, and when the repair crews checked the power plant, they found that something had burrowed underneath the building. The foundation was damaged, with voids under the concrete, and the entire building had started sinking. They pumped concrete into the voids, but the tunnels extended in every direction, a network under the town that they couldn't map. The crews said it looked like a subway system, except the tunnels were perfectly round and the walls were smooth, almost polished. 2 days later, a section of Front Street collapsed inward, creating a sinkhole 10 feet wide. When they lowered lights down the hole, they could see it. A tunnel, perfectly round, walls coated in frozen mucus, heading down at a 45-degree angle toward the sea. The tunnel was empty, but there were scratch marks on the walls and pieces of something organic frozen to the surfaces. Chunks that looked like shed skin or molted segments. The smell that came up from the tunnel was horrible, like rotting fish mixed with something chemical and wrong. Nome's mayor ordered an evacuation of the neighborhoods closest to the ice. About 200 people left town, but most of us stayed because where else can you go in February? I stayed because I had no family outside Alaska and couldn't afford to suddenly relocate. For a week, things seemed to calm down. No more sightings, no more collapses. People started saying it was over, that whatever it was had moved on. But I kept hearing sounds at night, scratching, grinding noises that seemed to come from underground. And the mail I delivered started coming back. Letters marked "Return to Sender" for addresses that definitely existed. 3 nights ago, I woke up to a sound under my house, a scrape, ping, grinding noise like something with sandpaper skin burrowing through frozen ground. My bedroom floor was vibrating and I could hear the support beams under the house creaking and shifting. I ran outside in my pajamas at 4 a.m, and what I saw made me understand that Nome was doomed. The snow around my house was moving in a perfect circle, a ring of movement about 30 feet in diameter. As I watched, my house started tilting toward the center. I grabbed my phone and car keys and ran to my Jeep. As I drove away, I watched in the rearview mirror as my house collapsed inward, falling into a hole that opened beneath it like the ground had been completely hollowed out. The sound it made, wood splintering, metal tearing, everything crashing down into an empty space, still wakes me up at night. I'm writing this from a motel in Anchorage because I left Nome and I'm never going back. Last night, the news reported that 12 more buildings in Nome have collapsed. The governor has declared a state of emergency, and geologists say the permafrost under Nome is structurally compromised. But nobody's saying what compromised it. I know what's happening. Those ancient ice worms aren't feeding on plankton or fish. They're feeding on the ground itself, dissolving the frozen earth and leaving voids. Nome is sinking slowly into a honeycomb of tunnels, and someday soon the whole town will collapse into the ice like it was never there. And those things will move on to the next coastal town and start again. This isn't climate change or natural subsidence. This is something that's been sleeping in the Arctic ice for thousands of years, and it's woken up hungry. It's eating Alaska from below, one town at a time. If you live in coastal Alaska and you start seeing strange patterns in the ice, don't wait around to investigate. Pack up and leave, because some migrations can't be stopped, only survived.